take power over the life and reputation of another human being in the village.
Accused witches are interrogated while being held prisoner. They are stripped so that investigators can look for telltale marks called witches' teats.
It was believed that the devil communicated with his witches through animal familiars, and the animal familiars were little creatures like sometimes mice or birds who would come to suck at a teat on the witch's body, and that would leave a mark.
Adding insult to injury, the accused witches are charged for their own room and board while in jail.
If you wanted to eat or drink, the jailer would give you food, but you would have to pay for it. And if you wanted good straw, or if you wanted new bedding every week or so, you would have to pay for that as well.
There is money to be made off of the witch hunt, and a lot of that money goes to Sheriff George Corwin, nephew to one of the magistrates.
Sheriff Corwin is related to the magistrate Corwin. He's related to some other people also on the trial court, so there's something a bit incestuous about all of this. It is not possible that the authorities could have been ignorant of what Sheriff Corwin was doing. That simply is implausible.
Sheriff George Corwin confiscates the property of many accused witches.
As some of the people are being arrested and taken away, Corwin goes over and starts appropriating their property, and he has no legal right to do so. But Corwin was grabbing wherever he could grab.
Perhaps the Corwins encourage the witch hunt to line their own pockets. Others may be using witch accusations to even old scores. In Salem Village, there is no shortage of bitter, long-standing disputes to be settled.
New Englanders in the 17th century were very fond of taking each other to court, suing each other. And there's, I think, a historical reason for that. One thing that's true of English popular culture is that it was pretty violent. People hit each other, beat each other. There was just a lot of physical violence going on. And one of the things the Puritans tried to purge in their model community was that physical violence. And so instead of hitting people, the Puritans encouraged people to sue each other.
In Salem Village, one name appears as plaintiff in many of the lawsuits: Putnam. Thomas Putnam Jr., aged 40. Thomas and his wife Anne are devoted churchgoers and ardent supporters of the minister, Samuel Parris.
Samuel Parris had important opponents in Salem Village. He also had powerful supporters. The most powerful group of his supporters was a clan, a large clan that came close to dominating Salem Village politics for many years, named the Putnams.
Thomas and most of the other Putnams support the idea of Salem Village having its own church. Many others would rather walk 5 miles to the church in Salem town rather than pay double the taxes to have one nearby. For years, this issue has divided Salem Village into 2 angry factions.
There's a clear continuity between all the old factional lines and the pattern of outbreak of witchcraft accusations in 1692. It's striking correlation.
Thomas Putnam and the women in his family, his daughter, wife, niece, and the servant, Mercy Lewis, are behind 181 accusations of witchcraft. Thomas's brother, Edward, participates in 13 cases. Brother-in-law Jonathan Walcott in an additional 7 witch hunts. People who have done the Putnam clan wrong are dragged in on charges of witchcraft, like George Burroughs. Reverend George Burroughs, aged 42, a Harvard graduate, witty, married 3 times. He had held Samuel Parris's job as minister of Salem Village 10 years prior, from 1680 to 1683.
The period of the ministry of George Burroughs in the village was a very contentious one. The villagers began to withhold his salary, which was their standard tactic when they started to feud with their ministers. And that meant that Burroughs could not repay his own debts.
Burroughs had borrowed money from a Putnam. When he couldn't repay it, Burroughs was arrested. But he successfully argued in court that he couldn't repay debts until the town paid his salary. Though the debt is finally repaid, The Putnams never forget their humiliation in court. By the time of the witch hunt in 1692, Burroughs is working as a preacher in the remote frontier settlements of Maine. He has survived the brutal Indian attacks that had killed many of Mercy Lewis's relatives, but he will not survive the vengeful Putnams of Salem Village. On the evening of April 20th, 1692, Ann Putnam Jr. says that the invisible specter of George Burroughs comes and speaks to her.
She declared that Burroughs confessed to her that not only was he the leader of the witches, not only had he killed his first two wives, but he had also killed the wife and daughter of his predecessor. And most importantly of all, he had bewitched the soldiers who were fighting the Indians on the Maine frontier.
Using only on the History Channel.
Every time!
You are watching Witch Hunt on the History Channel. It has been 5 months since the first girls started having fits in Salem Village. Now, in May 1692, the hunt for the witches who caused those fits is about to become a crisis for the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Have you baptized your children?
George Burroughs has been brought to Salem Village, all the way from Maine. During preliminary questioning, Reverend Burroughs displays a defiantly relaxed attitude toward religious ritual.
When did you last partake in the Lord's Supper?
It is so long since I cannot tell.
Have you not been to a Sabbath meeting since you can remember?
I was at meeting one Sabbath at Boston, part of the day, and at Charlestown, part of the Sabbath. The sacrament happened to be at both, but I did not partake of either.
Is your house at Casco Bay haunted and filled with toads, as some say?
Not haunted, no. But there are toads there in summer.
The arrest of George Burroughs captures the attention of the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony. Cotton Mather and other clergy are especially concerned. They already know about this renegade minister, George Burroughs. He has never been formally ordained by the Puritan Church.
To be an ordained minister, you had to have a formally organized congregation of people who had formally become church members. Burroughs never successfully had an organized congregation.
To Cotton Mather, Burroughs represents all that is wrong in a colony that is drifting away from its original religious purpose.
Many of the settlers in Falmouth, Maine, lived themselves too like unto the heathen, without any instituted worship.
The magistrates have the legal power to examine Burroughs, but not convict or hang him. The local jails are now crowded with accused witches awaiting trial. On May 27th, the governor orders a special court to convene in Salem town. There is a jury of men from around the county and a panel of distinguished judges.
None of the judges had any particular legal training. They were merchants and other leaders of the colony.
The Chief Justice, William Stoughton, is also Lieutenant Governor of the colony. He is known to be a rigid and dogmatic Puritan.
The special court would have differed from courts today in that the defendant had no right to an attorney. There was no defense attorney in 17th century English law.
The accused witch must defend herself, a difficult task when dealing with spectral evidence. The first case heard by the official court is that of Bridget Bishop. About 50 years old, she was also tried for witchcraft 12 years earlier and found innocent. But this time, the rules seem to be different.
One of the witnesses against Bridget Bishop was a 32-year-old man named John Lauder, who claimed that some years before, Bridget Bishop had crept into his room at night.
About the dead of night, I felt a great weight upon my breast, and awakening looked, and it being bright moonlight, did plainly see, said Bridget Bishop, or her likeness, sitting upon my stomach.
What did he say?
Now, of course, this was not literally Bridget Bishop. This was the specter of Bridget Bishop. This was Satan who had taken on the form of Bridget Bishop.
And I had not the power in my hands to resist or to help myself.
It was her specter. Bridget Bishop's accusers are not confined to the witness stand. People saying that Bridget Bishop is tormenting them disrupt the trial.
They completely influence, completely dominate all the courtroom proceedings. Now, this is very interesting because a defense lawyer would absolutely just stop the proceeding immediately and ask for the girls to be excused from the courtroom because their presence was just too prejudicial.
But in 1692, there is no defense attorney to object. Their afflictions are needed as evidence in order to hang the witches.
Either someone stuck a pin in her, or she stuck it in herself. Okay? I can't think of any other alternative. So, I suspect fraud here.
The pin is fraud, but that doesn't mean that you have to throw out the rest as being completely fraud. In psychiatry, if people do something wrong without having the intention, this is not really fraud.
Modern psychologists know there are cases of unintentional fraud, bizarre and dishonest behavior beyond anyone's control.
At that time, it was thought of witchcraft. Now, in the 20th century, it's called mass psychogenic disorder. Different labels, same behavior.
Caught in a wave of mass hypochondria, the afflicted of Salem begin to mimic the symptoms they see in each other.
Those girls were carried away, and there was this one-upsmanship again among themselves, so their affliction spread, and everybody wanted to be in the limelight.
What is your verdict? We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
On June 2nd, 1692, Judge William Stoughton issues the trial's first death sentence.
Found guilty of the felonies and witchcrafts whereof she stood indicted, and sentence of death accordingly passed against her as the law directs. Their Majesties William and Mary.
Now, King and Queen, allow you that upon this Friday, being the 10th day of this instant month of June, you safely conduct the said Bridget Bishop from their Majesties' jail in Salem to the place of execution, and there cause her to be hanged by the neck until she be dead.
No. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop becomes the first witch to hang in Salem Village.
Hang the witch!
The person was turned off the ladder, and by swinging free, your neck was not broken. Instead, you slowly strangled to death, depending upon your weight.
Disgusted by the hanging, one of the judges resigns in protest. The witch trials carry on without interruption. July 19th, in Salem Village, 5 more women are executed. Rebecca Nurse and Sarah Good from the village, and 3 more from neighboring towns. They are hanged because they do not confess, because they refuse to name others as witches. A strange pattern has emerged. Those who, like Tituba, confess to witchcraft and give names of more witches are never convicted.
They wanted more confessions, and there was an implicit bargain that was being offered. You confess and we don't execute you.
But not everybody is willing to accept that plea bargain.
Conspiracy talks to the devil. Saw him. Sounds illegal.
with Satan himself.
Right Honorable Sirs, I bring before you accused witch, Minister George Burroughs.
What we have in the case of George Burroughs is a quite detailed description that Cotton Mather included in Wonders of the Invisible World, and his account tells us pretty much what happened.
There were now heard the testimonies of several persons, and these charged the specter of George Burroughs to have a share in their torments.
Many travel from Boston to Salem town to watch the trial. The Putnam family sits at the front. Their maid, Mercy Lewis, is the first to testify. She describes an encounter with the specter of George Burroughs.
He told me the devil was his servant, and he did most dreadfully torment me, as though he would have racked me all to pieces. He urged me to write in his book, or else he would kill me.
As a child, Mercy Lewis had witnessed an Indian attack in Falmouth, Maine. An attack that had killed many of her closest relatives. Later, she worked as a servant to Reverend Burroughs. He was described as having dark skin, and some wondered how he had escaped not one, but several Indian raids unscathed. Abigail Williams calls him the Little Black Minister. Black, like an Indian.
This is one of the comments that Cotton Mather makes in his report, that a number of the afflicted people and others see the devil in the shape of an Indian.
The prodigious war made by the spirits of the invisible world upon the people of New England in the year 1692 might have some of its origins among the Indians, whose chief sagamores are well known to have conversed with demons.
George Burroughs, have you anything to say in your defense?
The court is crowded with witnesses against Burroughs.
George Burroughs was accused by 8 of the confessed witches as being the head actor at some of their hellish rendezvous, and one who had the promise of being a king in Satan's kingdom.
When one thinks of the status of a minister in Puritan culture, to identify a minister as, in fact, the leader of a demonic conspiracy, it must have been just a horrendous thought for the people of the day.
It was totally shocking to Cotton Mather. It was almost beyond belief.
Burroughs proclaims his innocence. He even goes a step further. He dares to challenge the very existence of evil specters.
I maintain that there neither are nor ever were witches, that having made a compact with the devil can send a devil to torment other people at a distance.
Burroughs' open defiance of Puritan theology is blasphemous.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
Guilty. August 19th, the day of George Burroughs' execution. Minister Cotton Mather makes the long trek from Boston to witness the hanging.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
With the noose around his neck, Burroughs begins to recite the Lord's Prayer. Cotton Mather himself has written that this is something witches can never do.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive them that trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Imagine the presence of mind it must have taken as you're literally facing death to, I don't think I can remember the Lord's Prayer under those circumstances, but he did. And the record reports that the crowd almost literally began to surge forward to prevent this hanging.
Recited the Lord's Prayer!
Hey! Hear me! Remember, George Burroughs
is no ordained minister. The devil has often transformed himself to an angel of light.
Cotton Mather, who had come out from Boston to observe the event, quieted the crowd, assured them that this man was guilty as charged. The hanging was a just act, and only in that way did the proceedings go on.
Burroughs is left to swing, slowly strangling to death. Cotton Mather's public endorsement of Burroughs' hanging will have deadly consequences. It heralds the bloodiest chapter of the witch hunt. The September executions.
Ready to double your chances of landing the right job?
The History Channel. September 1692. It is the final and bloodiest chapter of the Salem witch trials. By month's end, 9 more people will die by hanging. And worse. Giles Corey, husband to accused witch Martha Corey. Giles now finds himself accused in turn. But when Giles is brought to trial, he refuses to play along.
Since this court had only found everyone that was brought before them guilty, he had decided that once he pled not guilty, he was not going to cooperate anymore. It was an exquisite protest on his part.
Giles will not take part in the madness, and so becomes its victim.
They tried to force him physically to plead. And the way they did that was to place him on the ground and then pile onto his chest an increasing number of stones. They kept piling more stones and waiting. It took 2 days. When he was asked, well, are you willing to plead now? He's reputed to have said, more weight. And finally he died. A terrible ending. But they never convicted him of witchcraft.
Giles Corey's wife, Martha Corey, also refuses to confess to witchcraft. She is hanged 3 days later, on September 22nd, 1692, along with 7 others who refused to confess to a crime they did not commit, or to accuse their neighbors in order to save themselves. They are martyrs, part of a growing trend of resistance to the witch hunt.
There were people all along who had been waiting for a moment where they could step in the openly and credibly demand that the trials be stopped. And those people had to bide their time, because if they acted prematurely, they could be subject to accusation and death themselves. But I think that by mid-September, it had really reached the point where they realized it's now or never.
As more and more people began to raise questions about the court, the debate became louder and louder in Boston in particular.
Wealthy Boston merchant Thomas Brattle is one of those who begin to openly criticize the judge's methods.
With respect to such as confess themselves to be witches, I cannot but tell you, they do often contradict themselves. Even the judges themselves have caught them in flat lies. But the judges then vindicate these confessors and say the devil takes their memory.
Some confessors who have named others as witches in exchange for their own lives begin to have second thoughts. 17-year-old confessed witch Margaret Jacobs. Her accusations help hang Minister George Burroughs and her own grandfather, 80-year-old George Jacobs. The day after her grandfather is executed, Margaret Jacobs dictates a letter to the judges.
What I said was altogether false against my grandfather and Mr. Burroughs. He told me if I would not confess, I should be put down into the dungeon and would be hanged. But if I confess, I should have my life.
she really felt responsibility for that. And she thought she would rather die than continue to play this game of pretending, as the others were doing.
And Margaret Jacobs is not the only one recanting her confession. Soon, the judges have no choice. They begin to try even those who have cooperated. Not surprisingly, people stop confessing. The wild accusations come to an abrupt halt. Cotton Mather's own father, Reverend Increase Mather, writes a powerful plea to the court.
The whole thrust of the document was to issue warnings about the dangers of improper accusations. And they sum it up in the phrase that we're better that 10 accused witches should be spared than that one innocent person should die.
At the end of October, the governor dissolved the court. When the trials resumed in regular courts, spectral evidence was no longer allowed. But they did have to have more trials. There were still a lot of people in jail. Those people could not simply be freed. They had to be brought through a judicial process. And in fact, 3 more people were convicted, but the governor reprieved all of them.
When Judge Stoughton, who had presided over the Salem witch trials, hears that the governor has reprieved the last 3 witches, he rages.
Thereby the kingdom of Satan is advanced, and the Lord have mercy on this country.
William Stoughton was a true believer. He believed in what the court was doing. He believed in what he was doing. That's who he was.
It takes another 3 months before the 49 remaining accused witches are released. 3 have already died in jail while awaiting their freedom. Margaret Jacobs' release is delayed because she doesn't have money for her jail fee. Tituba had been the first person accused. A year after her arrest, she is released to a new master because Reverend Samuel Parris refuses to pay her jail expenses. 1697. One of the judges, Samuel Sewell, asks for the public's pardon in their prayers, that God will prevent his past sins from further damaging the country. 1703. The General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony throws out most of the evidence used in the witch trials. 1706. At the age of 24, Ann Putnam Jr. makes a formal apology to her church and to the families of those she helped execute.
I did it not out of anger, malice, or ill will to any person, but what I did was done ignorantly, being deluded by Satan.
1711. The colony begins the process of paying some monetary compensation to families of the accused. But Sheriff George Corwin never returns the property he confiscated illegally. Hathorne continues to live in Salem until his death on the 10th of May, 1717, age 76 years. He never apologizes.
After 1692, there are no more prosecutions for witchcraft. People didn't stop believing in witches overnight, but the legal system stopped dealing with accusations of witchcraft. The legal system was simply not willing to engage with the folk belief of individuals that their neighbors were witches any longer. It was too devastating, I think, psychologically. There were too many people who had died.
And what is really so...
Over 3 centuries later, in the home of one of the victims of the witch hunt, a group of historians debate the significance of the event.
Of course, this is right on the cusp of the beginning of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, in the sense that the world in which invisible spirits surround people is a pre-Enlightenment world.
Right, but in our post-Enlightenment world, we have loads of people who are having experiences with UFOs. So I think this theory of progress, it just isn't linear.
There is such an assumption that we would know better now. Such an assumption that somehow, if only we had been there, that we would have stopped it immediately. We would have seen through it. And
we would have known there were no specters.
We would have known there were, and we would have told them how to handle it, and it would have worked. And yet it seems very clear that at the time, people of intelligence and goodwill were actually taken in. And clearly this was a very scary and difficult to interpret and very difficult to dismiss set of events.
If we could push this one step further and look at the present.
In the aftermath of the witch hunt, Cotton Mather regretted that innocent lives might have been taken. But who was to blame? Was it Satan, or was it the Puritans themselves?
Did we not, between the sufferers on the one hand and the suspected on the other, carry things to such extremes of passion that the devil did bless himself to find such a convenient home among us? It may be that the anger which we have had against one another has had more than a little influence on bringing the devil to us.
Fabulous palaces and temples, aqueducts, artificial islands. When they created their empire,